Good evening. On behalf of the Cuba program of the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University, I want to welcome everyone who has joined us for this evening's discussion of U.S.-Cuba working together. Again, lessons from environmental cooperation, or Cuba, Estados Unidos, volviendo a trabajar conjuntamente y lecciones de la cooperación ambiental. We have this evening four of the moving forces behind a February 22nd, 2021 conference that brought together environmental specialists and sustainability experts in New York at Columbia University in order to discuss the lessons from cooperation on environmental and sustainable issues going back 25 to 30 years, and which intensified during the Obama administration, when a series of 7 memorandums of understanding were signed that related to environmental issues. This evening, we're going to have 4 speakers. Daniel Whittle, who is the moving force, one of the moving forces behind that conference and environmental issues in general, particularly in Cuba and Puerto Rico. He is an attorney and senior director of the Caribbean initiatives of the Environmental Defense Fund. He played a leading role in EDF's projects in Latin America in the past as well as the present. And he has co-founded EDF's program in Cuba 20 years ago and has been especially active in promoting cooperation on the part of non-governmental organizations, academic organizations, and even with governmental organizations in both countries. He has a particular interest in clean energy, and he has been also very active in developing joint courses in Cuba in particular to train Cubans, people from the States and from other parts of the Americas in terms of increasing their skills relating to environmental protection. And he, together with the other co-sponsors, have been very interested in revitalizing the memorandums of understanding that were signed between Cuba and the United States in the period from 2015 to 2017, which were never revoked by the Trump administration, and which this webinar, as well as the conference in February, explored in terms of whether or not the existing memorandums of understanding could be used to reinitiate dialogue between the United States and Cuba on environmental and sustainable issues. Our second speaker will be David Ferrer from the American College of Environmental Lawyers. It is not the ABA, as I had to tell the translators of this book repeatedly, but they have a particularly interesting program where they offer for free expert assistance, particularly in the legal realm, of organizations that wish to promote cooperation internationally or within their own countries in terms of major environmental issues and sustainability issues. He has been called upon in various contexts, for example, at Oxford University, as well as at international conferences, including in Cuba, in order to share his expertise. Their program on pro bono assistance, particularly in countries where such assistance is limited, has been critical, particularly in terms of providing the skills necessary for new experts, if you will, emerging experts, to join in with the ongoing cooperative projects that have been stopped. Certainly, some of their people probably are in Glasgow right now. Our third speaker will be Reynaldo Monzote, who is director of the Geohistorical Research Program at the Fundación Núñez Jiménez in Havana, which was one of the co-sponsors of the February conference, together with the Environmental Defense Fund and the American College of Environmental Lawyers. Reynaldo is very well known, not only in Cuba, but also elsewhere, as a leading expert on the evolution of environmental studies and research in Cuba. His book, which summarizes the history of environmental developments in Cuba, is an award-winning book that is available in both Spanish and in English. He also spent 5 years recently at the Macmillan Center at Yale University, teaching a number of courses with an emphasis, obviously, on environmentalism. And our final speaker will be Yosiel Marrero Paez, who is very active in promoting the idea of a conference that would focus not only on environmental issues, but also on the possibility of revitalizing the Memorandums of Understanding. Yosiel is the director of Economic and Responsible, I can't even read this, consumption program at the Antonio Núñez Jiménez Foundation. He has worked in various sectors within Cuba, most notably in terms of promoting energy, clean energy, as well as clean waters. And he is an individual who has been active in using the arts, music, dance, etc., in promoting public support of environmental advocacy. So these are our four individuals who will speak tonight. Dan Whittle will give us an initial overview. David Ferrer will talk about pro bono expertise that his organization has disseminated. Reynaldo will give us some of the highlights of environmental developments within Cuba. And Yosiel is going to remind us of the recommendations that came out of the February conference concerning environmental issues and sustainability. So we will now move to Dan Whittle. Dan?
Great. Thank you, Meg. And thanks to the Cuba program for organizing today's book launch and the event in February that resulted in this book on U.S.-Cuba environmental cooperation. And we've, in the chat, we've put the links to the EDF website and Columbia's website where you can get a PDF of the book. You're also welcome to contact us if you'd like a hard copy. We have limited numbers of copies, but we can try to make some available. This book reflects the effort of a broad range of people in both countries, united by careers in science, in the environment, and a commitment to collaborate across ideologies and borders. The authors are part of a long tradition of collaboration between Cuba and the US on a host of issues that are best solved by thinking, researching, working, and problem solving together. And I'm happy to report we have people who registered for this event from all over the place, US and Cuba, Canada, Glasgow, even Jakarta. And so welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining us. As all of you know, world leaders have been gathering at COP26 in Glasgow this week to address the climate crisis and hopefully to come away with new commitments to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions and help countries adapt to the punishing realities of climate change impacts. President Biden this week said, "This is the challenge of our collective lifetimes. The existential threat to human existence as we know it, and every day we delay, the cost of inaction increases." So let this be the moment when we answer history's call here in Glasgow. Let this be a start of a decade of transformative action. President Biden has essentially said, America is back and we're ready to lead. Cuba is also especially well represented at the COP in Glasgow and has been active and consistent in international efforts to curb climate change for decades, all the way back to 1992 at least. Cuba has also been aggressive on combating climate change at home for many years. In 2017, the Cuban government adopted Tarea Vida, or Project Life, a sweeping long-term climate change adaptation and mitigation plan, including strategies to protect natural systems like coral reefs and mangroves that protect coastal communities from rising seas and severe storms. Cuba has also made a commitment to move away from expensive and dirty fossil fuels toward a low carbon economy fueled by renewable energy. Its intention is to achieve 24% renewables by the year 2030. It's ambitious, but it's doable, especially if it can count on international support and partnerships from the US and elsewhere. Cuba and all of the Caribbean region are on the front line of climate change and at the mercy of international efforts to curb greenhouse gas emissions. Climate impacts are disproportionately high in the region as increasingly frequent and extreme weather events, unprecedented sea level rise, and warming waters are already threatening livelihoods, communities, and ecosystems. Countries, I have the privilege of working throughout the Caribbean, and countries in the region have developed a wide range of strategies to adapt to climate change and to make their economies, communities, and natural resources more resilient to it. I suppose the good news is that President Biden's plan includes assisting developing countries in the Caribbean to adapt to climate change and to provide support to them in transitioning to clean energy. In fact, climate change is a cornerstone of President Biden's foreign policy in the region. So here I am at a book launch on US-Cuba cooperation. So why am I talking so much about climate change? Well, for starters, as several articles in the book point out, climate change has long been an area of common interest with a significant history of joint research and collaboration, and that's only grown. More importantly, our two countries would be foolish not to deepen and expand collaboration on studying, understanding, and addressing the impacts of climate change. If we in the United States are to take climate change and other environmental challenges seriously, we just simply can't pretend that our neighbor to the south doesn't exist. Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados said just this week, I encourage everyone to look at her speech in Glasgow, but she said, quote, "National solutions to global problems do not work. National solutions to global problems do not work. National solutions to regional problems like oil spills, overfishing, loss of biodiversity, they also don't work. The BP oil spill in 2010 taught us that lesson in the Gulf of Mexico. You can't go it alone. Solving transnational problems requires that we collaborate across borders, and it's really that simple. When we got together in February of this year for a series of seminars on US-Cuba environmental cooperation, Many of us in that event were still hopeful that the Biden administration was on the verge of following through on campaign promises to reject Trump policies on Cuba and to replace them with policies that work, policies aimed at diplomacy and constructive engagement. As Meg Crahan mentioned, the 22 bilateral agreements signed during the Obama years are still intact, including at least 7 that are dedicated to environmental issues. And in February, we suggested that these MOUs provide an easy and logical place for the Biden administration to restart engagement. As we all know, the Biden administration has kept Trump policies in place and has sent mixed signals on whether and when he will make the changes he promised. Though Cuba does not appear to be a priority for the president at the moment, climate change and the environment certainly are. And so therefore, in my opinion and those of others, Cuba has to be part of that equation. So, I'd like to suggest that President Biden cannot fully deliver on climate or the environment without engaging with Cuba. And I certainly think my fellow authors would agree on that point. As Meg Crahan mentioned, the articles in this book resulted from a webinar on February 22nd, hosted by Columbia, the foundation of Antonio Núñez Jiménez, the American College of Environmental Lawyers, and Environmental Defense Fund, my group. In addition to the authors in this volume, there were several other participants in the webinar who are experts on the subject matter from US and Cuba. And together, to a person, they made a strong case for the US and Cuba to resume dialogue and cooperation as soon as possible. The book also provides a roadmap for doing so. So let me transition a little bit into the book. It's never been any secret to Cuban and American scientists that our two countries are connected and that shared environmental problems require shared solutions. People knew that 200 years ago. Scientists on both sides of the Florida Straits have been finding ways to work and study together literally for centuries, through good times and bad. The fruits of their labors have been many. Discovery of new species, advances in restoring and conserving soils, new approaches to pest management and invasive species that threaten agricultural yields and biodiversity, improved methodologies for tracking hurricanes, reductions in overfishing, new protections for endangered species, and the list goes on, and many are captured in this book. For example, in a brief historical overview of environmental exchanges between the US and Cuba, my colleague on this panel today, Reynaldo explores the genesis of scientific and environmental collaboration over the years, the diversity of scientists, academics, government officials, and business people involved in these collaborations, and why such partnerships have proven to be so mutually beneficial. I encourage you to read his books, but you might want to start with the essay in this compilation. Margarita Fernandez, founder and president of the Caribbean Agroecology Institute, writes about recent collaborations between academic scientists, farmers, and conservationists around the intersection of agriculture and the environment. In her piece, Grassroots Learning, Cuba-US Solidarity and Cooperation in Agroecology and Climate Change, Dr. Fernandez notes that, quote, over the past 3 decades, there have been hundreds of exchanges between Cuban and US farmers, alternative agriculture advocates, policymakers, and academics on agriculture, food, and more recently, the climate crisis. In her piece entitled The Sea, A Bridge That Unites Us, Dr. Patricia Gonzalez of the Center for Marine Research at the University of Havana argues that good policy and sustainable management depend upon sound science that's not artificially constrained to political borders. She examines collaborative research that has been critical to better understanding and addressing shared environmental problems, and in her case, particularly around the degradation to marine and coastal resources and the impacts of climate change. Dr. Gonzalez has also been one of the leaders of the Trinational Initiative on Marine Science and Conservation in the Gulf of Mexico, a research collaborative between Cuba, US, and Mexico that was established in 2007 and continues to the present day. In the US, that's managed and run by the Ocean Foundation. Liliana Núñez, president of the Cuban NGO Foundation of Antonio Núñez Jiménez, in the book addresses the important role that her group and other non-governmental organizations play in collaborative research and education. She emphasizes the social and cultural aspects of environmental protection, natural resources conservation, and sustainable development, and stresses the importance of stakeholder and community participation in decision-making. With the Environmental Defense Fund, the foundation was one of the founding organizations in 2016 of the Research Initiative for the Sustainable Development of Cuba, an international initiative focused on sustainability in several sectors of Cuba's economy, including energy, agriculture, and tourism. And then we have Valerie Miller, my colleague from Environmental Defense Fund, and who's director of the Cuba program. In her piece, Oceans of Opportunity, she writes that collaborations on overfishing and conservation of marine and coastal habitats have resulted in new working relationships among resource agencies, research centers, business enterprises, coastal communities around common interests and objectives. In other words, these collaborations really bring people together that don't have a long history of working together. Valerie and Miller and Patricia Gonzalez both discussed the partnership between EDF and the university and the Cuban Center for Fisheries Research in developing a new training program for professionals across the island working in fisheries-related fields. Training from this program has already resulted in tangible actions and policies in the country, including a new fisheries law, new fishery management plans, and a nationwide ban on Goliath grouper, which is a majestic fish, which is especially vulnerable to overfishing. And these partnerships really provide a pathway for future cross-sector initiatives on marine conservation and climate change. So we have a good model, good precedent in place. In the article, Back to the Road, Cuba, US, and Environmental Cooperation, Orlando Ray, a former government lawyer and now consultant to the Cuban Ministry of Science, Technology, and Environment, and who's in Glasgow as we speak, draws upon his experiences in collaborating with US environmental lawyers in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. And Orlando says, quote, "At that time, the potential of the environment as a space for cooperation was already very clear." That's in the late 1990s, as an area of mutual interest to both the United States and Cuba. Orlando notes that now is the perfect time to broaden and deepen Cuba-US environmental cooperation, but he reminds us that the level of cooperation seen during the last 2 years of the Obama administration was short-lived and has virtually vanished in the past several years, and says that for cooperation to become more resilient and durable, it will take a more lasting change in US policy and a strong commitment from both governments to make it work. And my fellow panelist, Yosiel Marrero of the Foundation of Núñez Jiménez, suggests that the 17 Sustainable Development Goals established by the United Nations in its 2030 agenda can provide a safe and diverse platform for bilateral cooperation between Cuba and the US at a time when all nations draw up plans and partnerships in achieving these Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm sure Yosiel will talk more about that. And then finally, a couple more. In his article, Cuba, US, Strategies on Furthering Environmental Cooperation, my colleague David Ferrer of the American College of Environmental Lawyers discusses the college's work to partner with the Foundation of Núñez Jiménez and opportunities to partner with the foundation and others in Cuba in the future. And then finally, in Conservation of Biodiversity, a space for Cuba-US cooperation, University of Havana Law School professor Daimar Canovas writes that global challenges such as climate change and loss of biodiversity cannot be addressed unilaterally. So he's basically saying exactly what Prime Minister from Barbados, Prime Minister Motley from Barbados said, national solutions to global problems don't work. He describes, Professor Canovas describes how both climate change and biodiversity are included in the first two bilateral agreements signed between the two governments in November of 2015. And he notes that Cuba has made protecting the environment a top policy priority, even under extremely difficult economic circumstances. And that now Cuban citizens have a constitutional right to a clean environment. He maintains that cooperation between US and Cuba is a, quote, ethical imperative, and that cooperation must go beyond the government-to-government accords and include the participation of NGOs, academics, and other non-governmental actors. The future, Daimar says, is in our hands. That the United States and Cuba have a shared interest in environmental protection and sustainability is undeniable. It's also undeniable that suspending dialogue and cooperation until political differences are fully resolved undermines our national interest and is costly to the people in both countries. In December of 2020, a bunch of leaders from US-based environmental NGOs wrote a letter to President Biden, President-elect Biden, asking him to set a new course, one firmly based on constructive engagement in the centuries-old tradition of science diplomacy. And consistent with that letter, the authors of this book are basically arguing for a renewed policy of scientific engagement that will advance the interest of the United States and those of the Cuban people in a way that ensures a clean and healthy environment and sustains natural resources upon which our societies and economies depend. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk today. I encourage everyone to download the PDF and to really take part in getting us, back to working together again. The environment provides an excellent roadmap. There's years of history for why it's important and why right now it's really the only option. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. We will now hear from David Ferrer, who is with the American College of Environmental Lawyers. David?
Thanks, Meg. And thanks again for your organization and support of the February webinar and shepherding us all to get the publication done. And now, again, to have organized this book launch, it's really well appreciated. Thank you to you and your colleagues at the program and at the university. And thanks for your intro. Yes, the involvement of our organization, I say our because Dan Whittle is also a fellow of the American College of Environmental Lawyers, stems in this case from the work of our International Pro Bono Committee. The college is a not-for-profit association of very highly experienced environmental lawyers from around the country, chosen because of their experience and because of recognized careers either in private practice, academia, government, and in non-governmental organizations. And one of the central goals of the group is to be of service, including internationally in pro bono ways. We've worked cooperatively with local partners to provide free legal services. We facilitate the provision of services. Here's how we do it. We enter into memorandums of understanding, MOUs, with particular nonprofit groups or governmental agencies. And then we and the nonprofit discuss the extent to which environmental legal services are requested. We identify particular projects. And then we put specific lawyers from our organization directly in touch with the agency or the nonprofit, which can select the people they would like to work with. And then the services are provided for free. The Cuba working group of our International Pro Bono Committee has been involved in outreach efforts in Cuba since 2015. In 2019, we entered an MOU with the Fundación Antonio Núñez Jiménez, we've heard mentioned several times, and with which two of our speakers are associated. I'll refer to them henceforth using the acronym they use, which is FANG. And we entered that MOU to explore the contributions that the organizations could make to each other, including development of specific consultancies and training on specific topics, and sharing knowledge and experience and the like. And the MOU then led to discussions with FANG representatives and others, including Yosiel Marrero, who's we'll be hearing from, and Liliana Núñez, who participated in the February event. And that led to identification of particular issues. And let me say a word about those, because it's interesting how they jibe with a lot of what we spoke about February, both in the morning and the afternoon sessions. Based on further input from FANG, we prioritized for commencing some more specific dialogue, particular points, particular subjects to find ways to make project-specific connection. And what we were focusing on for a seminar that was all set and to proceed in March of 2020 when everything shut down is still worthy of discussion, because it represents the kind of hot topics that really rose to the top in our discussions with FANG. One was how to have discussions about how to assure that environmental issues are addressed as a central element in negotiations between Cuban and foreign companies when they're contemplating joint ventures in Cuba. A second topic that was a particular concern was community enforcement of environmental laws. And how do you show a community the ways in which they can use existing environmental law and regulation as tools to prevent future damage? Who can community groups contact, and how to register a concern or a complaint? All issues of real concern. Another key topic was agricultural law and its relationship to environmental law. And I'll mention that more in a moment based on the discussion that we had in February. And finally, something that was of particular interest to FANG was the topic of urban trees. What are the legal approaches and mechanisms employed around the US to protect urban trees against damage or destruction, and to support or require the planting and sustenance of new trees? Where such laws have been established, who enforces them, and how? How do you effectively enforce when individuals or businesses or governmental entities, including utilities, cut down trees or damage them because of work being done in their vicinity? Typical examples being utilities drilling or putting up electric lines, impacts of air, water, and sewer pollution on trees, and people cutting down trees in front of their own homes. How can a regimen be developed, implemented, or enforced concerning planting new trees? Could one entity be put in charge of urban trees, including development of nurseries? So these were topics we were, and still are hoping, will lead to further discussion and targeting of topics in which the college can connect lawyers from our organization with organizations in Cuba to help with those goals. And then when we had our discussions in February, particularly in the afternoon when we were talking about strategies and where do we go from here, there was a great deal of thoughtful commentary, a lot of which Dan has highlighted, And I would just like to point out how a few of them, get us to additional topics beyond the ones I've just outlined that I think make sense to explore in determining which may be fruitful avenues for lawyers from our organization to collaborate with organizations and groups in Cuba. Pam Giblin, a colleague of Dan's and mine in the American College of Environmental Lawyers, when talking about climate change, spoke eloquently on the use of carbon sequestration methods and technology in agriculture to mitigate global warming. This is something of concern, equal concern. It's a great example of an issue of common concern in Cuba and the US. Pam had also, I think, as Dan noted, stressed the importance of coastal resilience. We've got issues that are very similar in both countries. On Hope Bastian's session that Dan mentioned this morning, I thought the topic of dilemmas being faced by small-scale fisheries, overexploited stock, and sustainable wild fisheries was a potential important area to seek if we can collaborate on. Corey Silverman Rayotti, when he was talking about renewable energy opportunities, he was talking, and he has spent some time in Cuba. And question was how to deal with renewable energy in Cuba, where there's such a highly distributed electric grid. Of course, we're dealing with issues like that again here in the U.S. Yordanka Castillo-Porras, who talked about executing more environmental memorandums of understanding, spoke to this issue of community rights and enforcement powers on the local community level that resonated with the discussions we had with fans. When Lee DeHines talked about addressing environmental issues as an element of negotiations between Cuban and foreign companies, he went into some detail on some thoughts about concepts of ensuring transparency in those transactions, and that there are considerations of impact to the local community. I think that, again, enhanced the discussion we've been thinking about having on negotiations between foreign companies and Cuban entities for development of Cuba. Dan mentioned Daimar Canovas's session on issues that included biodiversity protection. I mean, every day we're seeing more and more here discussed about biodiversity and how critical it is. Some of our writers on nature and the environment, like Margaret Reynaldo, who has written beautifully on nature and culture, but on nature, has recently became a regular columnist in the New York Times and has been contributing just beautiful and thoughtful articles on issues having to do with nature, and recently wrote quite a beautiful column on the importance of biodiversity. Yosiel, I will leave. Yosiel had quite a bit to say about the future of US-Cuba relations, and rather than steal Yosiel's thunder, I think I will leave it for Yosiel's discussion and anything that we can jump off on from there. So really with that, I think I've laid out where we would like to be headed. I think we've gotten a great start in thinking about these issues, and let's try to keep the momentum going and take this to the next step. And with that, Meg, I will turn this back to you.
Thank you very much, David. Before we hear from Reynaldo Funois Monzote, I'd like to provide a couple reminders. A couple questions have come up, not for the panelists, from the audience. The video of the February 22nd, 2021 conference can be found on YouTube as well as the Cuba program website, which is under Columbia University. Secondly, as has been mentioned at the outset, but some of you entered the webinar a little bit late, the PDF of the book is available on the EDF's website as well as on the Cuba program website. And those links are both in the chat room. So if you're interested in getting a free copy, obviously, of the book, you can download it from either the EDF or the Columbia University Cuba programs websites. And now we will get back to the really interesting stuff with Reynaldo Funes Monzote, who is recognized as perhaps the leading expert on environmental issues and developments in Cuba. Reynaldo?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Margaret, and everybody. I want to thank again to you for the invitation for the session, the February session. Also, Josiel Marrero, my colleague and friend, and Liliana Núñez, and Dan. And for me, it was a great opportunity. And I don't like to consider myself as an expert, not. But for many years, I'm being studied the environmental history of Cuba. And that's is my goal in some way to connect. That was my contribution to this book as a kind of background of the current relation between scientists and environmentalists in Cuba and the United States working together, no? In a collaboration that never stopped really from the 19th century to the present, but a collaboration very affected by the political relation between the two countries, by diplomacy, conflicts. And we usually see the history between Cuba and the United States through this lens of conflict since the 19th century, but mostly after the Cuban Revolution, no? And in some way, we lose this long history of exchange between the two countries in the history, in many areas, in many fields, with many people from the United States that came to Cuba very early, and many Cubans that went to the United States to develop their scientific careers or their environmental concern as the people in the United States. We need to depart, of course, from the close relation between the two countries since the end of the 18th century, but mostly during the 19th century. And we need to consider that Cuba was maybe, or well, not maybe, was the tropical country closest to the United States. And this shaped many of the ideas about the tropics between the United States and Cuba. We have books, for example, about the beginning of the ideas about biodiversity, focus on other countries, on Panama, but that relation maybe start with this Cuba-US relation since the 19th century. Of course, an economic relation, political relation, social relation, but also in this field, in this area, the relation between Cuban scientists and the Smithsonian Institute since the 19th century, the relation around the yellow fever and the control of the yellow fever that was so important to the connection between the United States and the tropics and the rest of Latin America. And that relation was built in many ways together between Cubans and the US citizens, no? And it's a conflictive relation at the same time, not? But it's rich, and it's a relation that we need to know all the period after the occupation of Cuba and the creation of the Cuban Republic, how many people working in all this field in agriculture, for example, after the creation of the experimental station of Santiago de Las Vegas, For example, I always like to mention to Hugh Bennett, that was a very famous soil scientist in the United States. And he came to Cuba in the 20s and wrote a very important book for the soil science in Cuba. And it's the same in many areas, many Cubans that, for example, in Colombia, Salvador Masip, the father of the modern geography in Cuba, Sari Salgué, his wife, who studied in the United States and later back to Cuba and maintained this kind of collaboration always with the US scientists. And we need to follow many of these examples to have inspiration, and that is one of my goals as an environmental historian. I hope in the future more students from the United States come to Cuba to study this connection, because it's important to know these people in the United States and their work in Cuba. And we are attending today also as the history lesson with all your intervention, no? Because how many work are doing scientists and environmentalists in the two countries, despite all this conflict that we have in other areas, in other fields. But it's a disgrace at the same time to have this kind of relation, no? Because how much we are losing in the last years after this connection that many people began to build when the relation, diplomatic relation improved during the last years of Obama government. And I hope this kind of relation improve in the future. And maybe Cuba is not a priority for the United States, but of course, for Cubans and for the Cuban government, it's very important to have a better relation with the United States, because it's a big country. It's one of our main neighbor, of course. And there are a lot of examples. Even in the worst moment of the Cuba-US relation, we have a sample of this close connection between Cuban and United States scientists and environmentalists. I mentioned in my paper the case of Rachel Carson and the Silent Spring. That was an inspiration in Cuba during the 60s, as in the United States and all the new environmental movement around the world. And that was the first book of the so-called ediciones revolucionarias in Cuba in the 60s, a program to copy many of the most important books in the scientific fields, and was used for many scientists in Cuba in the 60s. Many of this bibliography came from the United States and was printed in Cuba in that moment. Then we have a lot of examples. I know more or less well the case of the agriculture, as Dan mentioned, the organic agriculture, urban agriculture. In a very bad moment in Cuba, many people from the United States came to Cuba to help with this movement, to support Cuban scientists, Cuban farmers, to develop a new form of agriculture. And it's an example for many countries today that approach to a new form of agriculture in Cuba. The connection in these studies in marine science, not, for example, also. And we have a lot. I just introduced some of the samples, the work of Kenton Miller in Cuba, the creation of the protected area system. And we need to rescue many of this history to have inspiration for our own work. But at the same time, all the people who are present in this book, and then we can read many of the chapters, are making history, no? In this new relation between Cuba and the United States. Then the goal with this conference, with this seminar in February, was to influence in some way for a better relation between the two countries. That was many months ago. And we are still optimistic about the new relation in this and other areas, of course. And I think that history is very important for this. We have very different history, the good or the bad histories, but I always say that it's better to focus in the history that is common, that is more, that give us hope for the future, and not forget the bad histories between the two countries also, no? But I think these issues are very relevant, and we need to continue our collaboration and our effort to build a better future between the two countries. And it's a relation in the two direction, by the way, no? We need to learn to win from the relation with the United States, and also the United States can learn something about our life in Cuba. And this is very important for the scientists, for us. It's good to have this opportunity to connect through the technology, but it's also very good, the opportunity to visit the field, especially in this area, no? To see the people, to see the landscape, to explore our flora and our fauna, that our farmers go to the United States to visit the US farmers, or the Puerto Rican, for example, all the work that some of you are doing to close the connection between Cuba and Puerto Rico and other Caribbean countries. And thank you very much again for this opportunity. And we hope to support all this effort from our expertise, that is the environmental history, and as many other colleagues. Thank you very much, Margaret, for this
Thank you, Reynaldo. Before we move to Yosiel Marrero Baez, I'd like to remind our audience that if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box, and we will ask our panelists to respond to your questions after Yosiel presents us with a summary of the recommendations that came out of the February 22nd conference. The recommendations were very diverse. There were a couple dozen recommendations. They were all within the realm of possibility. And Yosiel, who brings to his work at the Fundación Antonio Núñez Jiménez, where he is one of the leaders and one of the prime movers behind the February 22nd conference, has had a special interest in linking science and the creative arts. And so we're going to ask Yosiel Marrero Baez of the Fundación Antonio Núñez Jiménez to kind of explore this interplay of science and the arts and elaborate the recommendations that the February conference ended with, and that you can find in the book. In both, by the way, the book is in both Spanish and English. Yosiel.
Thanks, Margaret. Have been a pleasure. If we think already now that exactly a year ago, we were talking of this idea, and a year after we are launching the book. It's have been a big efforts and a lot of work from Margaret and Gretchen and all the Columbia team, from David, Daniel, and was a previous work previous to February conference. And already now we have the pleasure to be presenting that book, and thanks to all people that have been participating in that. More than have been announced, Margaret, that I will talk about recommendations. And it's true, but I will change a little bit that, because 8 months after our February conference, things have been changing a lot. Look like in the last 8 months in United States, in Cuba, and of course in the relation between Cuba and United States. I think already now that all what we have launching the public now in the book they are more important, all those topics, all those recommendations, more than the 8 months before. Because already now, US society is more polarized. Cuban society is more polarized a lot already now in the last 8 months. And the relations between US and Cuba in all economical, political, in all things is more polarized, and we have more live conflicts. Then it's very important, more than before, that the environmental work can contribute to building consensus in our polarized society. And that is a very important thing that it's a new deep polarization that already now we have in our specific society and in the relations with, US-Cuba relation. But I think that in Cuba already now, all the environmental work, all the environmental issues could be one of the more important topics to work on the society in conflict. In the future topic that I want to be working on, how we can use it, all environmental topic on that. It's because of that in our conference, a lot of Dan have been resuming more or less what all panelists in the Ferrer conference have been talking about. Dan just speak about a very important topic on that was he provide, like he did already now, an overview of relevant moments of environmental cooperation between Cuba and the United States. I think that the more important recommendation from Dan already now in the updating situation now is that we have to reproduce those environmental cooperation moments that we had already now in this polarizing situation. We have to reproduce. Orlando Reyes at that moment recommends and focus on the value of US-Cuba cooperation. It's the same, beyond the bilateral impact. He highlighted the need to strengthen the multilateral cooperation, which end those efforts with resilience. Already now, the resilience, the environmental resilience, the social resilience, it's should be more focused on how we will remediate and be resilient to the conflicts, to the social, economical, and political conflict that we have in our own society and that we have between our governments and between our countries. Sylvia, Patricia in the conference from Marine Research Center, our colleague and friend, she's explaining how that research in marine sciences has expanded since 2000, mainly motivated by the situation of a greater Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. Already now, again, that sea, the sea that unites us, Dan, it's the big phrase that supports the work that we do together. The sea that unites us, already now we have to be more together in trying to resolve all the conflict, all the problems that we have in our own society. And the Patricia Gonzalez paper, it's very good because go deep on what marine sciences could be a very good work to be working together. Funes, already now, he did all the very important perspective from environmental history between two countries. And Margarita Fernandez, like Dan mentioned, she remarked that the US-Cuba agroecological network involves small producer, policymaker, university, and research center was a model of collaboration. Already now, we have to redesign our model of collaboration. We have to redesign our topic of collaboration on environmental issues, of course, but for sure, today more than more than the 8 months before, is more important those topics. Valerie Miller from EDF, she discussed the possibility of cooperation in marine issues such as climate change, overfishing, pollution, and work with migratory species. David, he already have been talking about his paper, and Hope Bastian, she just provide a very important point, that is the anthropological perspective, explaining the social and economical context on Cuban society in the last 10 years, and how that have been changing in the situation that Cuba faces in that after the pandemic. That the anthropological perspective, it's already now very important in all the process of polarization and conflict that we have now internally in Cuba, and in United States internally. You are just increasing a lot of polarization and conflict too. The topic from the energy grid and its distribution in Cuba was aboard by Corey Silverman, and that it's a topic that in Cuba we are working a lot. She explained that there are some problems in energy transmission in Cuba, that we can generate local pollution, but instead of that, there the necessity to develop clean energy sources like social energy and other alternative energy source. Jordanka in the conference just put on the table for us and discuss the role of legal instruments in the promotion of international cooperation, particularly the importance of MOU that provide great flexibility. Explaining the Cuban governmental agency are mandated to sign this kind of legal instruments, it's important to identify the competent authority and establish the cooperative goals. You know, in the last 8 months, we all have been waiting some change in the Biden policy for Cuba that have been on changing a lot. Is because of that it's that topic that Jordanka Castillo put on the table is very important, because more than before, we have to be accurate with MOU and all the possibility, all the legal instrument that we can use it to promote the environmental work between two societies. Daimar Canoas, he explained that environmental issues cannot be unilateral addressed, neither by the state nor by the public administration at the local level. And he mentioned the Cuban contribution to the International Convention on Biological Diversity. Lee Dehens referred to the process of negotiation with investor and law between citizens and investor. That is a very important topic, because we hope that in the future, for sure, we should continue the work together, and the foreign investment, direct investment or not, from United States. And there are some recommendations that already now, more than before, and Dan mentioned it, that I'm sure of that personally, that the Sustainable Development Goals established, you know, by United Nations 2030 agenda provide for sure, now more than before, a safe and diverse platform for environmental cooperation between Cuba and United States. And I can say now, that it's a safe and diverse platform to resolve the conflict that we have in our own society. And of course, at the same time, when all nations makes plan and relationship for their fulfillment of the Sustainable Development Goal. An immediate practical action already now, still we need more than before, between the multiple agents of both parties should be aimed at prioritizing which of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals we will work together on as first stage based on common interest and needs. Of course, there are a lot of action that it's urgent. We need to establish joint relations with international financial institutions which allow access to funds for multinational projects for the recovery and protection of ecosystem. We need that a lot. It's a way to resolve a lot of conflict and create path to be working to keep living our relations and the work together. We need the action to create a regional network of academic and scientific institutions from Cuba, the United States, and other countries of the Caribbean in compliance with the Sustainable Development Goals, Sustainable Development Solution Networks. That is an organization, the Sustainable Development Solution Network, that put together a lot of organizations working on the solution of the Sustainable Development Goals. We need to create, of course, more than before, again, create spaces that promote foreign direct investment in business model that are managed with corporate social environmental responsibility. And again, more than before, we need to elaborate between academic, scientific, governmental institutions and civil society of both countries a portfolio of projects which makes clear the priority proposal for the conservation of our natural ecosystem and the sustainable social economical development of our people. And it's that the recommendation, what we realize already now, that today, 8 months after our conference, it's more important that all our institutions, all our organizations keep together, thinking and working to continuous working together in environmental topics. But environmental work, it's very important to resolve all our problems in our society, in all the conflicts, or resolve all the conflicts, looking the situation of deep polarization that we have in Cuba and in United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Josiel. Before we move to the questions, I'd like to mention that the Memorandums of Understanding are included in the book as an appendix. In addition, the bios of all of the panelists at the February conference are also included in the book in English and in Spanish. And the 4 speakers here were all involved in that conference, so their bios are there, which I summarized. There's also a short list of resources that individuals interested in pursuing the issues more substantially can go to, and as an appendix in the book. I'd now like to turn to a couple questions that have come in. And the first is, what kinds of tensions have you seen in environmental negotiations? What are the challenges you see going forward in terms of the continued existence of such tensions, et cetera? And I'll ask all 4 of our speakers to respond to them respond to that question in the order in which they initially spoke. So it'll be Dan, David, Reynaldo, and Josiel. Dan?
So let me repeat the question. So what tensions have we seen in environmental negotiations and how to overcome those tensions?
Yeah, or what impact are they going to have going forward? And given the fact that Glasgow is going on right now, et cetera.
Well, yeah, let me jump in. So historically, the last several decades, there have been relatively few government-to-government talks on the environment. There's been extensive collaboration between NGOs and Cuban partners, including Cuban government partners. But in terms of actual negotiations, there haven't been that many, but there have been negotiations where they really, really matter. For example, the US government and the Cuban government have been collaborating since the early 1960s on hurricane detection and preparation. Cubans have shared their airspace with planes from NOAA, and Cubans have visited the US to meet with their counterparts on how to respond and prepare for hurricanes. After the BP oil disaster in 2010, there was no mechanism for Cuban agencies to reach out to the Coast Guard or the EPA or the Department of Interior in the US. They had to go through the State Department, and the State Department didn't have very effective channels to communicate with their counterparts. So we saw that early on in the oil spill, which was a serious threat to Cuba's waters and communities, early on, NGOs such as Environmental Defense Fund and others served as a conduit, as a bridge. But that was short-lived because both governments realized they had to find ways to talk about and ultimately negotiate. And what happened is once they started talking about oil spills, they realized the Americans, first of all, realized that Cubans were very expert in understanding oil spills and preventing them. And so you had this really interesting coming together that happened very quickly at the technical level, where there's a quick understanding that we can work together and need to work together to prevent oil spills from happening in the future and from responding to them. So in my experience, whenever the governments have actually gotten together, and then they did so after the environmental accords, it's been incredibly respectful. The focus has been on common issues like how do we prevent overfishing.
Can you do right up the two?
And Meg, I think you're not on mute.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. But I've seen that in actual negotiations around common issues, there's been relatively no tension because there's been a recognition that it's in the interest of both countries to work together. Now, if we seriously begin negotiating on issues, there are inevitably issues of disagreement. I mean, Cuba has been critical of the US for not doing enough on climate change, not reducing emissions, being back and forth, and legitimately so. The US probably has some criticism of things Cuba has done in their waters, not to, for example, reduce overfishing fast enough, overfishing of species that the US depends upon. So that there are areas of disagreement, but the only way to identify and respond to them is actually to sit down together. And so, I think the prospects for negotiations are quite positive, and think we have, more that we can do together than disagree on. So let me hand that over to David.
Thanks, Dan, and that was very thoughtful. Since we've entered the MOU with the Fundación, we have not moved forward on a project, so I can't speak to particular situations that we've been involved with, or I personally have been involved with in Cuba. We're still looking to get started. But what I thought would be helpful to point out is that when I think about environmental tensions in matters, is the topic, one of the key topics that we've been asked to focus on, this issue of assuring that environmental issues are addressed as a central element of negotiations between Cuban and foreign companies on joint ventures. And I suspect that it will be a similar experience to how things developed on the environmental side in the US. When environmental laws were still first starting to have a significant impact on real estate and business transactions in the United States and in the various states, because much of it is state-driven in the US. Environmental lawyers really didn't have a place at the negotiation table yet. And big deals were getting negotiated and in some cases completed before anyone had thought through the environmental implications, which then led to tremendous tension between the negotiating parties once the deal was done and the matter was proceeding. It led to, in the US, enormous amount of litigation, development of quite a body of case law, and eventually the development of kind of a standardized process of doing due diligence into a project to determine what the environmental issues were, and environmental lawyers having a critical place at the negotiation table from day one, so that the issues were out in the open and discussed and could be resolved or not in the course of negotiating the transaction, and not be left to be a problem later on. I anticipate that will be a similar situation if, as I've gathered from discussions with our Cuban friends, there's a sense that those environmental issues are not up front currently in negotiations on joint ventures. That's what I have to say.
Yosiel? Reynaldo?
But in this case, I prefer that Josiel say something, but I not see in this field a lot of tension in the negotiation between Cuba and the United States. But maybe in the future, we will need a lot of negotiation. For example, in the case that US investment come to Cuba, arrive to build hotels, for example, and that will be an area to discuss together now with the support of the people in the United States who know very well the environmental law in the United States, people in Cuba, how to manage this. I remember something that Dan promoted, a short film in the New York Times about the Garden of the Queens, the coral reef. And it's very interesting, not about the challenge that of the massive arrival of tourists to these areas, not more or less isolate. And I see the tension for the future, not for the present. I think maybe we have already the base to develop a good connection in many fields, in many areas around the environmental issues and about the climate change. The big tension is that climate change is a very general concept. I don't see climate change only about climate or one more or two more degrees. The question of food, the question of agriculture, for example, the impact of the embargo policies over the Cuba food security, for example. And that is an area of tension between the two countries that maybe deserve more discussion, no? And the environmental consequence.
Thank you.
Meg, one other thing occurred to me while Reynaldo was speaking in terms of tensions, when Reynaldo mentioned the hotel development that's been going on and has been so significant, both in Havana and resort areas and the like. You know, one of the tensions that arises there is that between the desire to build and the stress on infrastructure, sewer, water, and we've observed that obviously when we've been in Cuba, and it was a topic to which a colleague of mine and I spoke when we came down to Havana in 2015 or 2017 for the one of the international conventions on environment and development in Havana. So I just wanted to raise that because it seems to be an obvious one.
Yeah, thank you. That's obviously been a topic that Yosiel has focused on in terms of energy as well as sustainability. So perhaps you would like to speak to some of the comments that David just made. Yosiel?
Yes, the topic right now with the climate change, it's a very important topic for Cuba, independent of the relations with the United States. It's because of that is the Tarea Vida. So it's like a task force of the Cuban government, Tarea Vida, to just all the action and strategy for climate change. But of course, we are in the same position in Cuba, risking a lot with foreign investment and a big investment in tourism, not only building tourist facility, it's how you manage the tourist, the operation of tourism with plastic, with all natural resource, with protecting areas. And that is a topic that we have we have to deal with that. Our organization is working a lot on that, and really, where there, like in all countries, there are some tensions between environment.
UCL? I think UCL has been lost.
There it is.
Hopefully briefly. UCL, are you back?
And explaining. Hello, and explaining. Yes. Yeah, but now it's...
Go ahead, UCL. We lost you for a couple of minutes. Go ahead.
Yeah, that here, not the tension with United States. Here, sometimes there are some tensions, and there are some normally discussion. We have a discussion about the genetically modified organisms. We have discussion about what kind of agriculture, what kind of mining, and all of that. Just it's a complement with climate change topics. But of course, always and everywhere have been big discussion with that. And we are working a lot, demonstrating now with the private sector. Right now, you know that there are new law for small and medium scale enterprises. And our institution, my program, have been working in the last 10 years a lot with the new enterprises, state and private, in order to sustainable business creation and sustainable business development. All the, responsible, corporative responsible, social responsible enterprises and all of those topics, but really it's hard. At the Obama era, we were risking a lot. We have very good relations, but we were risking on the environmental topics because big US enterprises have been coming and they want to, be very aggressive with all the possibilities that the Cuban government give. And we were very carefully to tell everybody, Americans, and with help of a lot of American organizations, advising us who are good or who are not good. Because of course, there are a lot of good organizations, a lot of good companies in the United States, but there are a bunch of not good companies in the United States. And we have visiting here people from, Caterpillar, from Pizza Hut, or a lot of companies that really we don't like reproduce those environmental business models. We, after 60 years, or more than 60 years of that kind of social, political, and economical organization that we had the possibility, and Cuba is the perfect lab to implement all alternative business and economical model. And we have the commitment and the right to implement all those financial and economical system. We should to have, and Cuba is already now the perfect lab to do that. We'll see, if all external and internal conditions allow us to continue just stopping the not good ideas.
Just real quick, Meg, if I can jump in on that last two points. So there is an area of tension, and it's going on right now, and it relates to the environmental challenges that Yosiel and David mentioned around pollution and around the poor infrastructure, wastewater treatment, etc. Cuba has a lack of access to a lot of technology because of the U.S. embargo, which really restricts, even with resources, it has difficulty in buying technologies that are made in the U.S. or have parts made in the U.S., et cetera. So there's a real limit on what it can find internationally to address wastewater treatment, for example, or clean energy. It has a pretty ambitious goal to move away from fossil fuels, which would benefit us in the US. We could prosper by selling technologies to the Cubans, by helping build solar farms and wind farms, but US law doesn't allow that. So there is a certain amount of tension between on this sort of access to environmental technologies front. So, and that's something that could be resolved, only by negotiation.
Right. Relating to negotiations, there's a question that under President Obama, there existed a bilateral commission which met and focused in part on ecological issues. Have any such meetings of that commission occurred since the beginning of 2017 or under Biden?
So I'll jump in. So real quick on that, there were some ongoing talks on several environmental issues during the Trump administration in the early years, especially on oil spill prevention and response, U.S. Coast Guard with Cuban counterparts. There were some discussions on some of the other issues like marine protected areas, but they were few and far between. To the best of my knowledge, they completely stopped during the Trump administration. And I'm not aware of any Biden administration contacts with Cuban government on the issues in those accords. But as everyone has pointed out, those accords are still valid. So all it requires is an agreement between the governments to start talking again. But right now we're treading water.
Related to that is a question of who is lobbying for such communication between Cuba and the United States, within the United States, et cetera. Is there hopes for a coalition, perhaps, of NGOs, academic institutions, and others to bring pressure to bear on the Biden administration to revive the MOUs relating to the environment and sustainability?
Yeah, and Meg, I'll jump in on that one too, I guess. So the Center for Democracy in the Americas and several other DC-based groups put together a really impressive report last year on not just the environment, but all kinds of issues, a path to constructive engagement, to re-engagement. Part of that report included input from a number of environmental organizations, including mine. And then that report also spawned a letter to President-elect Biden, basically outlining why environmental cooperation should be resumed and how to do it. So you could call that lobbying. A lot of our groups have including publishing this book, have made the case, a strong case for resuming cooperation, and have suggested ways to do it, even in this political environment. Made a case for why it's doable. There have been other moments of U.S.-Cuba history that have been even more tense, and there has been, as Reynaldo points out, a continuous history of cooperation. So yes, there are groups out there, including most environmental groups who have done work in Cuba, are continuing to do what they can to talk to their people in DC for why it should happen. So so I'll just leave it at that. Invite anyone else.
And maybe Yosiel and Reynaldo could speak to whether or not there are any indications within the Cuban government of a strong interest in resuming discussions about environmental and sustainable issues. Yosiel?
Yes, direct indication we haven't, already now, because even better than me that the situation now is very tensions. There are a lot of tensions. And even all of you, all of your organization and you personally, Dan, David, you, Margaret from Columbia, a lot of university, a lot of institutions have been doing a lot. I was in last June in DC having meetings with State Department, with all the different organizations, and look like they are the possibilities what they have to do. I mean, the government. From our side, you know that always in polarizing situation, in conflict situation, it's difficult to sit and talk in family atmosphere, in friends, colleagues, in any environment. But already now is because I told in my presentation that more today, more than 8 months before, is more important that we go deeper, that the sustainable development goal, the environmental work, it's a very safe way to work, to continue working together. You can remember that the aim 1 year ago in October 2020, when we were talking about this conference and this book, what the aim that just we put together is that we have to demonstrate politicians that the environmental issues is the issues of peace, issues of continued talking, you know, independent of all the political ideology and all of that things. And we all, our organization, and we all, our life and the relation with the United States is a good example of that. My life, my first study in the United States was 20 years ago. Funes have been working and teaching in a very important university at Yale University for 5 years, and nothing happened. I studied my master's degree in the United States 20 years ago, and nothing happened. You, Margaret, you are the big example of that. You have been working for Cuba, I don't know, 50 years, something like that. And all of that with, Dan was the first institution, because Dan is almost an institution, that put together NOAA in a ship in the sea, you know, not in land. He put together American officials with Cuban officials in a boat, you know, in a boat, not on a saloon, was in the boat. That means that we have to continue doing that, you know. But my recommendation in my meetings there last June was doing things on action, not, you know, continuous talking. We love to talk. We all are good talker, our organization, but we need to be present in breaking all the obstacle, breaking with actions, with action, concrete action for our community in both sides, because we have problems here, environmental problems, but you have problems there too. And the best way is just resolve problems together in both sides and be learning and sharing experience in both sides. We have to do asking all licenses, respecting all the restrictions and regulations and law, everything. But we have to do that. And there are a lot of participants, a lot of friends. John McCullin, Ramon Dubon, Milay Galvez is there with our organization. She's trying to do something in Cuba. There are a lot of people that they are with us already now in the conference that they are doing that too. We have to continue working. There are not any other exits already now.
Reynaldo?
I completely agree. I don't have a lot of information, but I consider that in Cuba, the people is completely open to continue to maintain this kind of collaboration, and the people are working, you know, because the same, maybe United States don't have a lot to lose, but we have a lot to lose in this kind of relation that we have just now, no? And I think it's very important to push, to continue our work, everyday work. That is more important. And when the situation improves, for sure the people will be prepared. I think there is a question who in the government, John Kerry, for example, he was a Secretary of State that came to Cuba to open the embassy again. And for sure, there are more people that know very well all this work in Cuba and in the United States and in Cuba, and they will be ready to resume, I imagine, no, from the Cuban side, this kind of conversation. And we have a lot of challenge, but we can be optimistic also. My concern is how to maintain a low footprint in Cuba. How we continue, because maybe one of our quality is that Cuba developed a kind of low input society, no? Compared with the standard of the United States and other very developed countries, no? And that is our big challenge, I consider, how to improve our condition of life, our way of life, but without damage the environment that we depend from, no? And I think it's very important to build this collaboration, not to think that everything will be solved with a good relation with the United States, and we need to be prepared. And we have many people very conscious about this challenge in both sides, Cuba and the United States. But we hope many people are working to prepare a new age of U.S.-Cuba relation in environmental aspect issues.
Thank you, Reynaldo. There's a related question, and that is, are there any Biden officials who were involved with Cuba during the Obama administration that might be served as a stimulus within the Biden administration to engage with Cuba?
So I guess I'll go first again. Yes, there are. And
do you want to name names?
I'll name a few of them. And probably one of the most important is John Kerry, who Reynaldo just mentioned. He was Secretary of State, and so it was largely a big part of normalizing relations with between the U.S. and Cuba. Opened the embassy, and his people were the ones who negotiated the 22 bilateral agreements. So if anyone gets it, it's John Kerry. Plus, John Kerry is the envoy for President Biden on climate change. So he understands Cuba and he gets climate change and he sees how they fit together. And then there are people from the Obama administration, in the Biden administration, in the Department of Energy, in the White House, in the Department of Defense of the United Nations. You have a fair few people who were part of normalizing relations who know how to do it. So I think the challenge with the Biden administration is they're hearing different voices within the party, within the administration on the political realities of engaging with Cuba or not. And also there are, of course, disagreements within Congress, and there are a bunch of considerations about the implications in Miami and in Florida. But the Biden administration has a large number of experts who, if given the charge to resume engagement, could lead that charge. So hopefully it's just a matter of time.
We hope that they receive and read this book that we are launching today.
It's available in PDF for anybody who has access to a computer.
No, but they need hard copy. Meg, please send them hard copy.
Okay.
They need touch. They need touch.
Okay. We will load people down with copies to the degree possible. There's one final question regarding climate change. It has been said that climate change is, in quotes, a rich person's problem. and poorer populations face more pressing issues. Keeping this in mind, is climate change a way to bring the US and Cuba together, or is climate change important regardless? Is it not just a rich person's issue?
Well, again, I'll take my prerogative of going first. In my comments, I referred to the remarks from Prime Minister Mia Mottley from Barbados. It's an 8-minute speech. It's available on YouTube. And I invite anyone to watch that. Climate change is an existential crisis, and it affects low-income people, vulnerable populations more than anyone else. Rich people can adapt faster and more effectively. I work in the Caribbean that experiences tens of billions of dollars in damages every year. In Puerto Rico alone, they experienced about $90 billion in damages, and the people who suffered the most were low-income people in Puerto Rico. They're the ones who are displaced. They're the ones who are migrating to other towns, communities, and countries. So it's no question that the poor in the world are suffering a disproportionate burden because of climate change. And it affects food security as much as anything else because of droughts and soil erosion, et cetera, and the list goes on. But I can't say it nearly as well as Prime Minister Mottley, so that's where I'd start. Again, it's available on YouTube. But any of the developing country representatives at COP are making a compelling case that it's the rich countries who are dodging the bullet, and it's the poor countries who are paying the price.
Yosiel, do you want to comment on this?
Yes, it's. I agree 100% with Dan. We work a lot in the Caribbean and in South America, in a lot of countries. In general, I think that the impact of climate change will be pushing an impact to all people. But like all problems, of course, people are more affected by that. And it's because of that, again, that all the strategies, all the financing strategies that we have to design, and all the big fund to work on social, economical, environmental problems to resolve that should go to, and we have to work on that, should go to poor communities. But not only because it's normally that to resolve climate change is putting money on community, that they build some infrastructure things, but it's trying to prepare those people in all aspects, socially, economically, political, giving all the skills, just preparing them that in order that they can obtain in their self the resilience level, the resilient scope that they need just to really be resilient in the future, because the impact will be big, very big for them mainly.
David?
Yes,
Any comments on this issue?
Just to add that even when we're looking at the wealthier countries, the more highly developed countries, and you see scenes of devastation from climate change, you see the disproportionate impact on the poorer people of those countries.
Reynaldo, final words.
Okay, so I think the same, but the problem is if you not connect climate change with many other topics as poverty, for example, no? Of course, maybe in the poor countries, poverty or food is more important than to talk about climate change, but climate change consider many of these affect the agriculture, for example, and the migration from Central America and from the Caribbean to the United States has also this dimension, no? And I think we can separate both. Maybe in the rich countries, people talk more about climate change, but the challenge, the threat is maybe bigger for the poor countries to confront the consequence of the climate change. Many of these countries are islands, as Cuba, for example, no? But I think that we need to solve this together, no? Not as a nations, as a world. And that is the most important lesson. But not to talk about climate change without to talk about underdeveloped, about poverty, about the lack of food or education or health. That is also very, very important as part of this big challenge of the climate change.
Thank you, Reynaldo. I want to thank all of our panelists for being so generous with their time and their ideas. This has been a very rich discussion, and I think it will go up on YouTube in a couple of weeks, and hopefully it will generate more discussion of these issues. And indeed, as part of the project, there are 5 young people who are receiving scholarships in order to work on the recommendations that the February 22nd conference offered at the end. So we will hopefully generate at least some activity amongst the younger generation in terms of exploring these issues further. There will be 3 Cuban students and 2 from the US who will receive scholarships to continue researching these issues. And we hope that that will keep, obviously, the dialogue and discussions going on. In addition to thanking the panelists, I want to thank, in particular, Ellen Johnson, who's to my left here, who's been keeping us technically linked in, and also Gretchen Sanchez, who's also provided some technical assistance. And finally, I want to thank the audience for tuning in. And indeed, I see that virtually everybody stayed. So I think the discussion obviously merited their attention. And we look forward to carrying it on further through our institutions and through our personal efforts. So thanks to everyone for tonight's event. And hopefully we will come again together to carry on this dialogue. Good evening.